Well, it wasn't too long ago that the U.S. and Russia were celebrating an historic partnership and agreement with the passing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. It was to be a reset in U.S.-Russia relations. As it turns out, the celebrations were short-lived, with heightening tensions between the two countries on many levels. There's Russia's anger at the U.S., being unwilling to budge on its plans to build a missile defense shield. There's the U.S.'s anger at Russia and its refusal to approve a plan for the UN Security Council to intervene in Syria. But there's also more. Last year, the U.S. imposed a visa ban on 11 Russian officials accused of playing a role in the death of Sergei Magnitsky, a Russian attorney who many believe was exposing corruption by Russia's Interior Ministry. Magnitsky was arrested in 2008 on embezzlement charges and spent more than a year in jail. Then he became very ill and was apparently brutally beaten before he died. So this move by the Obama administration is to say, human rights abusers aren't welcomed here. Well, guess what? Russia is fighting back with a list, also of 11 officials, but from the U.S. Now, these are officials the Russian government says are also tied to human rights abuses for their role at places like Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib prison, committing what would also undoubtedly be human rights abuses. In light of the G20 conference starting today, we want to talk about the way the U.S. is viewed around the world. And I've got David Swanson, campaigner for Roots Action, to help me do just that. Hey there, David. Let's first talk about this move by Russia, essentially to say, hey, you want to talk to us about human rights abuses? Why don't you look in the mirror? What do you think about this?
Well, I think it's a sad state of affairs that we don't have an actual international body to be saying these kinds of things to every nation. But I think that, of course, the U.S. is hypocritical. There are other nations that have seen threats of prosecution and actual convictions result in the same policy. Italy has convicted a couple of dozen CIA agents for kidnapping a man and sending him off to be tortured. I think it's entirely appropriate, but I think this going back and forth between nations is a sad state of affairs. And I think that there is a larger picture here where the United States policy of the past decade has contributed hugely to a growing acceptance of torture and other abuses around the world that needs to be turned around.
David, you say this going back and forth is a sad state of affairs. But what's, the answer here? Because, of course, both countries want their people, have their people saying, hey, you can't just do business with Russia, for example, to the Obama administration. You have to, condemn this. And the same thing on the Russian side, people saying, you guys are hypocrites. We're not going to stand for this. I mean, don't you think it's important that they sort of stand their ground and make sure that this is out there, that they don't approve of what the other one's doing?
Well, I do in both cases, but both sides are hypocrites. I think we need an international criminal court that's not under the thumb of the United States to prosecute universally and fairly such abuses by anyone anywhere. And at the moment, we don't have that. We have something worse. We have the pretense of it. We have an international criminal court that only acts where the United States approves and only prosecutes war-making and war crimes by Africans. I think that the idea of international law is being degraded by this process.
David, what do you think it would take for that to happen? I mean, this idea of an international criminal court that was, totally objective. What's in the way right now of that happening?
The structure of the United Nations, the structure of the International Criminal Court, the power of the United States as a rogue nation that is understood increasingly by much of the world as a rogue nation that is sinking in the polls and respect as a model for other nations around the world. I think we need to open up and democratize the United Nations so that it is not under the thumb of a handful of nuclear powers, but is actually a democratic body representing nations that represent their people. And that's a huge step, and one that many in the United States, as you know, are against.
I think it's an important point, David, to talk about this, how you say, sinking in the polls, in the respect level around the world. What do you think? I mean, a lot of people sort of look at what happened, back in the 90s, the U.S.'s involvement in Bosnia. A lot of people, saw that still as, the U.S. Intervening for good purposes. And, really, it did a lot of good, I think, in some ways for the U.S. reputation. Do you think it's just sort of been downhill from there? Do you think it's been a series of events or a couple of events that have really made it worse for the U.S. and the way this country is seen by others around the world?
Well, there's been a lot more polling in the past decade or so, and there was a poll this week by Pew showing these trends internationally. But I think it's a long-standing trend going back to the 80s or earlier of the United States sinking as a model, as a destination for immigrants, as a dream for the world, and becoming a nation that is resented and feared, and increasingly a nation that is experienced most directly as a set of military bases occupying other people's nations. This is a trend that has been developing for decades and needs to be reversed.
It's really interesting, of course, because we see every year the State Department, the U.S. State Department, puts out a human rights report card. Countries like China, Venezuela, Uganda, Yemen, they're often highlighted as some of the biggest offenders. But I guess talk a little bit about, and I guess this sort of goes along with what you were saying, how there isn't really an international criminal court. There isn't really an international, superintendent or teacher to issue these report cards.
No, there's not. There are nations critiquing each other almost universally with hypocrisy. And yet the United States has become not just among wealthy nations the one with the greatest inequality and poverty and incarceration and environmental destruction and so forth, but the nation that is exerting the most power over others, is perceived as doing the most to damage the climate, is perceived as doing the most to spread torture and assassination as acceptable policies, and doing the most to hold down other countries' development and advancement. And so there is, this idea that the United States is uniquely important is in some ways right, but not in the way that it's often understood.
I think it's really interesting when you look at this. It's hard for me, though, to really see that this is discussed very much. Certainly within this country, I think a lot of Americans are still surprised to this day. Certainly the majority of Americans surprised on 9/11 to know that there was, a negative attitude towards this country. Still, 10 years later, I think a lot of people would be surprised. I mean, do you think it does a disservice that this is not talked about? What we're talking about here right now is not talked about more widely.
Well, of course, there was almost universally in the U.S. corporate media resistance to asking and condemnation as treason to ask what might have motivated the crimes of 9/11. Just as today, people will ask you, what do you expect the president to do if there is someone evil in Yemen? Doesn't he have a choice of killing him and anyone near him, men, women, and children, with a missile, or nothing? As if those are the two options. And you can't talk about legitimate criminal prosecution, and you can't get back to talking about why there might be people in Yemen, increasingly people in Yemen, who are bitterly angry at the United States, as if you yourself would be attacking the United States to ask that question.
I want to go back to, this list that, Russia has put together with these names of U.S. officials. We don't know who's on this list at this point. But what they've said is that these people are affiliated with crimes committed, at Bagram Air Base, at Guantanamo Bay. I want to talk about Guantanamo Bay really quick. In a few months, we're going to have an election here. We remember the last time we did this, President Obama said repeatedly, he made it a campaign issue, I am going to close Guantanamo Bay in the first year of my presidency. We have several examples of this. Here we are. It's year 4. And nothing's been done. Do you think this is going to be an issue? Do you think this is an issue that Americans care about enough to vote on in 2012?
Well, yes and no. I mean, those who go in for lesser evil voting calculations may still vote for Obama. It's not as if his opponent, of the two acceptable opponents, wants to engage in a different policy. But, we should understand that Obama didn't want to end the policy of lawless incarceration. He wanted to move one location, one facility to Illinois instead of Cuba. That was not the sort of change that people envisioned. And what we have seen while Obama has been president has been the further entrenchment and formalization and acceptance of these policies of lawless detention, of military use in the United States, of torture and rendition, and increasingly of murder as an alternative, which many people think of as more clean and more acceptable. And I find that so utterly reprehensible that I strongly urge everyone listening not to vote for either of these catastrophically bad candidates.
Yes, but I mean, a lot of people, David, think that if you don't vote at all, the people with all the money, they're the ones who are going to win. They're the ones who are going to have the say in what happens.
Yes, well, vote for Rocky Anderson, vote for Jill Stein, and act accordingly for the other days of the next 2-year period, which are far more important than the election. If elections alone changed anything, as Emma Goldman remarked, they would be banned. It is not as important who you vote for. Vote for Obama if you must, but don't be Obama's servant. Don't be the servant of your public servant the rest of the year. If you can do that, I'll have little argument with you, but most people can't. They see their role then as being a cheerleader for one of the two teams, and that's what's led to this disastrous collapse of the peace and justice movement while Obama has been president.
Yeah, certainly a lot of expectations that have not been met during these last 4 years. David Swanson, thanks for joining us. David is a campaigner for Roots Action.